Out of anybody in the history of the universe, Jesus could have taken care of his own needs. It's about partnership, and it's about doing this together. And it's hard when we come from America, when we're just like individualism and independence and bootstraps mentality. We're not made to labor and live outside of community and outside of the body.
And entering into dependence on the Lord and everything that is included in fundraising. And we can't help but be positioned into greater and greater dependence on the Lord or greater and greater dependence on ourselves. And so that process is going to change you. It is going to change your character because it's going to continue to put you in front of opportunities to trust and depend on the Lord or try to do it yourself.
Welcome to this episode of the Modern Day Missionaries podcast. Today we'll be speaking with Heather Winchell and Andy Brennan. And we're talking today on the topic of fundraising. And we usually categorize topics like this under finances on our podcast website. And we'll certainly categorize this one in there as well. But we're also going to be categorizing it under the faith category, because today we're leaning very heavily into what fundraising does in us, what it can do to us. And maybe that's something that you haven't thought of before. We're going to talk about the spirituality of fundraising and go deep. It's going to be good. It's going to be rich. Because if we don't get this right, we better stop on our tracks right now and make this priority number one over how much we raise, how we do it, how much we get. We got to get to the heart of the matter, which is what we'll do today with Heather and Andy. And Heather and Andy are part of Provisio Fundraising, which is an organization that provides online training and one-on-one coaching. They also have a podcast. It's called It's Not About the Money, and it's in its 4th season. It's great, so you have to check it out. And so Andy primarily does coaching with individuals who are a part of Provisio. And Heather also does coaching, but she primarily works with organizational partnerships, content creation, and client relations. And Heather and Andy just love helping missionaries and other support-based workers thrive in their fundraising so that they can, in all strength and freedom, do what God's called them to do. So with that, let's dive into today's episode with Andy and Heather. Hey, Heather and Andy, thanks so much for joining us today.
It is our pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yes, and we're talking about a subject that is near and dear and a little challenging to missionaries' hearts, and that is fundraising. And I know this is what you do day in and day out. Let's help serve people who are looking to better their fundraising efforts and grow.
Yep. And we like doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're gifted to do it. So in talking about fundraising today, we're going to look at it a little bit differently. And so when we think about fundraising, it's a part of our job. Like our job is missions, but then we kind of like, and I also have to do some fundraising. But no, it's an actual part of our job that God's given us to do. So we recognize that a job shapes us and forms us. So if I have a job of being a construction worker, it's going to literally shape my body by strengthening certain muscles. If my job is in a really heavy intellectual capacity, maybe I'm creating systems or I'm a computer program, it's going to form and shape my mind and my brain. So our jobs shape us and form us. And I was thinking about this, Heather, because you and I had talked earlier, and you said the phrase fundraising as formation. So fundraising forms us. So I'd love for you to say a little bit more about that for a second. How does fundraising as part of our essential job and calling that's God's given us, how does it form us, and why is that important?
Yeah. So I guess a couple of things come to mind in that for me. And the first is just this understanding that we are all being formed, right? We don't move through life static. We are being shaped by the world outside of us and certainly our own internal world as well. And with that, and a quote that comes to mind is from Dallas Willard. He says, "We live at the mercy of our ideas." And really what that means is that our ideas actually give shape to the way we act in the world, the way we feel, and the things that we do. And so I think that Andy and I just really enjoy thinking about, okay, really all of life is formation, and fundraising is especially a season, a reality that forms you, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way you think about it, the way you act, those things are forming you. And so we just really feel like it's an invitation to see that God has so much purpose in that season and that it's not just about the money.
And I think back to a young lady that I was coaching years ago, maybe one of the first. Her name was Anna, and she said something to me after we were probably several months into our relationship. And through our curriculum, and we were just kind of checking in week after week. She says, I think every Christian should fundraise at some point in their lives. And that just felt so contrary, I guess, to what people normally think. And I was wrestling, like, why did she say that? And I think she had arrived at this conclusion that there was significant formation in her life because of the challenge of fundraising and the obstacles and the things that and the fears and everything else that she had to push through to get there. And I think she was reflecting on just how much that faith muscle was strengthened in this process.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And I think one other thing I would want to say, Stephanie, just because the word fundraising can actually be pretty agitating for some people, especially in the mission space, because I think there's been a lot of, evolution of thought in the way you think about how God provides. And I know that a lot of ministries have gone to using terms that align more with the heart, right? Ministry partnership development, friend raising, people raising, things like that. And we do still use the term fundraising because we believe that that is actually a concept that people have distorted ideas around. And so we want to use that term so that we can invite them into seeing it differently and hopefully changing the trajectory of those thoughts to be more aligned with the partnership and God's provision as opposed to the funds.
take some of the edge off of it.
Yeah.
Take some of the sting out. Yeah.
Yes, redefine it.
Yeah.
Freshen it up a little. An old term that's still relevant.
Yeah.
No, and it's good. And when people are looking for fundraising help, I'm thinking of all of our missionary listeners who are probably going through the fundraising episodes and how's this going to help me? And maybe they're listening right now and like, are they going to help me? Are they going to tell me things that are going to help me raise more money? Because that is, I think, oftentimes where our default goes is like, how can I just raise more?
Sure.
And I think in talking to you guys, there's this foundational thing that's got to happen in our hearts before we get to that point. So it's not that we won't talk about some practicality and get into some tools later on.
Right.
But if we don't get this part right, then we're building on a faulty foundation.
Yeah.
And I love what you were saying there, Andy, too, about someone had mentioned, too, that all Christians should fundraise at some point. So accurate. I was reading A Spirituality of Fundraising, Henry Nouwen, a book that we all love.
Yep.
It's a good
Wow.
one. And yes, everybody should read it. It takes like 30 minutes to read. It's so short. He writes things so short and so powerful, which is great. But he talks about fundraising being as holy of a calling as preaching a message or serving the poor or anything like that. And you read that and you're like, but really? Because we think of it as this necessary evil. But no, God calls it to be something joyful that he calls us into. But let's talk a little bit more, too, about how fundraising has the potential to change us. So how can God use fundraising as a tool to make us more like him?
Man, I feel like it's all about dependence and control. I think if you were to walk into any church in America and ask them, like, okay, guys, you've heard this verse, God takes care of the ravens. How much more will he take care of you? I think everybody's just going to say, yeah, I believe that 100%. But how many of us have been in a place in our life where we were forced to depend on him day to day, like a bird does? Probably very few of us. And it's not that we're saying that we should live in complete depravity or we should go be a hermit somewhere and, all this kind of stuff. But I do think, we love Dave Ramsey. He's great. Like, let's save money. Let's be careful. Let's be wise. Let's be good stewards. But I do think you lose something when you aren't forced to depend on him to that extreme. And I think fundraising is a unique opportunity to experience that.
Yeah. And I'm reminded, so we earlier this week had an opportunity to have someone on our podcast, Tony Detman with Funding Tribe. And he was just talking about that he always talks to people that enter into their cohorts and tells them like, hey, your character is going to change in this process. And I think to answer your question, Stephanie, in entering into dependence on the Lord and everything that is included in fundraising and then in ministry thereafter, we can't help but be positioned into greater and greater dependence on the Lord or, greater and greater dependence on ourselves. And so that process is going to change you. It is going to change your character because it's going to continue to put you in front of opportunities trust and depend on the Lord, or to try to do it yourself.
Well, I loved Tony's example. I mean, we won't go into his whole story, but he was raising funds as part of campus outreach, something like that. And I think he was just completely overwhelmed by the amount that he had to raise. And I think it was probably like 20 grand or something.
Right.
And that for him was a substantial amount of money at that point in his life. Through a miraculous series of circumstances, he gets fundraised. And then he's talking to us maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years later, however long he's been doing this. And he's like, well, the Lord, that was a challenge, but now the Lord continues to challenge me. And now he's increasing their budget by 100 grand or whatever he was saying. And that even today, like that feels like so much money to him. And so the Lord keeps expanding his ability to have faith and to trust him in those things.
Yeah. I love that we're saying a word that people probably are just shuddering a little bit when they hear over and over again. We're like, dependence. Be
I know.
dependent. Be dependent on God. Invite yourself to be dependent on people. Be dependent on others. And everyone's like, no, I want to be independent. Like, it's a miracle anybody becomes a missionary when you think about this huge aspect of what it is that we willingly step into to do what we do. But like, thinking about what you guys just said, I mean, what happens if we find ourselves ever at a point in life when we are not dependent on God? That's horrible. That's a recipe for disaster right there. So man, as missionaries, what a blessing. We have the opportunity to live in constant dependence at all moments, at all time.
Yeah.
And
it is a gift.
Yeah.
Well, and it's cool, right? Because there's a tension. Like, I really believe that as we are equipped in the Lord, we do become more and more capable of the work that he's given us. And yet, as we grow in that maturity and capability, we are becoming ever more dependent on him, which is a good thing, right? Because, I mean, we know from the word that Jesus only did what the Father had him do. Like, God himself in the flesh was dependent on God the Father for the work that he did. So how much more do we need to be dependent on the Father, right?
Yeah, and maybe it's reframing the picture of what we think dependent looks like. I think sometimes as Americans, for those of us who are Westerners or Americans listening, we can picture a dependent person as someone who's like needy and despondent and like, I'm dependent. Or we think of the word codependent, like, oh, it brings up all these bad images. But you guys just brought up, Heather, you mentioned Jesus. Jesus lived fully and absolutely dependent. Well, we don't imagine Jesus in our minds as like, oh, God, just help me, help me, help me. No, there's this confidence. Like, what does confident dependence look like?
I think for me, like when you talk about Jesus being dependent, like that feels so contrary to a lot of people. But in reality, like if you're getting into Luke, like Luke captures this wonderful passage where he notes every single person, not every single, but he notes some highlights of the people who are taking care of Jesus, who are giving to his ministry. And I think he names like 3 or 4 women. He made a conscious choice to put that information in there, right? Like, why did he include those details? And I think, right, out of anybody in the history of the universe, Jesus could have taken care of his own needs. And so that's in there for a reason. And I think it's to model like that. It's about partnership, and it's about doing this together. And it's hard when we come from America, when we're just like individualism and independence and bootstraps mentality. It goes against our culture, but I feel like that's not what we're made to do. We're not made to labor and live outside of community and outside of the body.
Yeah. And I think what I would add to that is just that I think that a confident dependence is knowing your part and knowing God's part, right? And I think what Andy said around community, we're not supposed to be codependent, but certainly interdependent. I mean, we were created to be in the context of other people and to need them as we need the Lord. So
I love that, interdependent. You know, as you guys were talking, I was remembering, I was reading the book Honest Advent this December. And there is a whole chapter that he has in there on Jesus being dependent. And I mean, you think about the fact, not only was he dependent on God, I think we can stomach that, but he was dependent on other people. He was dependent on his mom and dad for food. He was dependent on his teacher to teach him. He was dependent on his friends at different times, on his disciples, to maybe organize something that he asked them to do. Like, he placed himself in a position where he was dependent on humans. Like, it kind of blew my mind a little bit. So if Jesus can make himself interdependent, dependent on God and others, how much more are we also called to step into that great step of faith, really? I mean, there's a risk involved in that, because when you depend on people, sometimes they let you down. But
Right.
there's so much opportunity in it, like you guys have talked about. Okay, so as we're talking about fundraising as formation, we've delved into a little bit how it can form us in good ways. So if it can shape us in good ways, can fundraising also shape us inappropriately and in a direction we don't want to go?
I think so. I think that whenever fundraising lands on us and we aren't holding rightly our part and God's part, then we can overemphasize our part. And that can start to become something that creates more dependence on ourselves, as opposed to an invitation to seek the Lord and just do our part. Yeah.
And I think if you're fundraising on your own strength and you are maybe you're financially secure, or you have a fantastic system and a formula, and you're really clever and you've thought it all out, and you just have contingency plans, and whatever the case may be, the temptation is to think like, look what I did, and not to learn that dependence up front before you depart your home context. And then if that's the case, you bring that onto the field with you. Like, look what I can do if I just figure this out.
Mm-hmm.
And you create a formula for how to do ministry. And if that falls through, man, I feel like those consequences could be tragic. You're like, well, Lord, did I miss something? Did you really call me to this? You start to have all these doubts and second thoughts, and everything kind of crumbles if you've been relying on yourself the whole time. So I think it can be catastrophic, if that's not too strong of a word to use.
Yeah, well, I would say pride is catastrophic.
Yeah.
It's one of
Right.
the 7 deadly sins. Kind of seems like the worst of those. And like you said, if it all falls apart, then you find yourself going, what happened, and pointing the finger and looking to blame. And I think that's a good point to bring up, because somebody could be listening and be like, well, I'm fine with fundraising. Like, if the money's coming in, if I've got things working out, why do I have to look at this foundational stuff? Like, I'm raising money. It's fine. Because you're saying something could happen at a certain point. If we rely on our own strength, something's going to happen at a certain point. It's not going to necessarily always come in. There's going to be a crash. And then where do we go from there?
Yeah.
And that's our whole point, right? Like, it's not about the money. Like, we chose that for a reason.
Right.
Like, it's about more than that.
Right.
I'd love to hear for you guys, what does it look like when fundraising becomes deforming rather than forming? Because Heather, I know you've got a story on this one. Andy, you might too. But Heather, you hinted a little bit at yours to me, so I would love to hear it.
Yeah. I think, and again, it goes back to just rightly holding our part and God's part. Our part is to cast vision, provide invitation. God's part is always the outcome, right? That's not ours to own or ours to control, which is the same in ministry as well when we invite people to believe. And I think one thing that really stands out to me is, so my family and I were at a concert. It was a really fun concert. And during some of the breaks, they would have a representative from a world relief organization that would take the stage and share stories and share just kind of what's going on in other parts of the world and different ways that the audience could become engaged in that. And I'm so thankful for the work that these companies do, so needed. And I just remember sitting there with my family thinking, because of the work I do, I just remember feeling like, there is such power in story, in the way we tell story. And I feel very strongly that the stories we share, especially in moving people towards generosity or inviting them into generosity, I think it's very important that those stories are shared with dignity and that they're not wielded in a way that we're trying to control the outcome, that we're trying to elicit funds.
To manipulate.
Right. In the very like strongest sense of the word, to manipulate. And I think we can do that without even meaning to when we walk into that feeling like we need to make something happen. So I think that I felt a little bit like that it felt like instead of being presented with an invitation to see what God might want to do and how he might want to use me in that, it felt kind of like a compulsion to give. And then kind of another element that just really made that feeling sink into me was that there was a moment later in the show where they had everybody that had made a decision to contribute raise their phone and turn the light on so that it was really clear who had given and who hadn't. And again, I want to be really generous of heart in maybe the why. I think it could be that they invited that so that people could see, wow, God moved in power and provided.
Right.
But also in that, how is that forming the audience? Because then do people feel free to consider giving, or do they feel like, oh gosh, this is embarrassing. Like I'm
obligated.
Right. I'm obligated. And then, we talk a lot about how fundraising is formation, but not just for the individual, but also for the church and for others. And I think this is a moment that experience teaches somebody, right? It forms them in a way.
Forms the donor too, right?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, it forms the person to then walk into the next opportunity. And if they even have a whiff that there's going to be a presentation and an ask, are they going to feel free to really engage with God on what they should do? Or are they going to feel compelled to give? Or are they just not going to go because they're going to feel like to go means they have to say yes? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's powerful, Heather, because that means that we have the opportunity, I don't know if opportunity is the right word, but we have the power basically to influence someone's perspective on generosity and giving, and how we present it is going to perhaps turn them off to participating in the work that God's calling them to do. So we like paying attention to how we communicate with others tells us something about ourselves, but it's also affecting them and telling them something about God. So that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
the
thanks for bringing
alternative
it
to
up.
that would be, what if everybody always had a positive experience when somebody asked them for money?
Yes.
Like what's the multiplication? What's the ripple effect of that, of like a whole congregation or a whole wave of churches in an area that just love to give because that's so refreshing and so gratifying and satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
There was another one
Yeah.
too about like, was it an auction or was it like?
No. So yeah, as we were kind of talking about things before this, I shared another story with Andy that just really drives this point home for me. And it was a local ministry. They do such great work in our community, and they have a yearly kind of fundraising gala where they invite the community, they have somebody speak, and then they have an opportunity to give. And this speaker, the tool that he leveraged in inviting people was that in proportion to the gift that they gave, they would be given an actual wrapped present. And if it was a large financial donation, they would get a really large like gift to hold. And if it was a smaller donation, they would have a smaller gift to hold. And again, I'm not sure what exactly the like aim behind that was, but the felt feeling in the room was, man, your gift is bigger than my gift. And what do I think about that? And so it's just, I think that we have to be aware of how the tools we're using, how that lands on people, what that's really communicating, whether it's putting the emphasis on the money and us, or whether it's putting the emphasis on the Lord and his provision. And so that was another story that came to mind.
And I think we want to be, again, like you mentioned, we want to be gracious and assume that the strategy was from a good place of like, we got to hit these very important goals. I'll do whatever it takes to get there. But I think the danger is inadvertently, maybe we are belittling this kind of widow's mite offering rather than honoring and uplifting the widow's mite.
Mm.
So that's tough.
That brings up another point. Andy, you referenced this a little bit too. It's making me think of this is how we are, who we ourselves bring to with the messages about generosity and giving and what do our personalities contain, and how do those intersect with the message that's presented to us? For example, what were the messages that my parents taught me about
Mhm.
generosity, or my church, kind of like you were saying, like what you were talking about, churches all just giving together and everybody just loving to be generous because that's just how they do it. So when we've got people who maybe they were raised by parents who just gave freely, and like it's so normal to give and it's so normal to fundraise, and then you've got other people who were like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah.
We work for ourselves.
Yeah.
So there's that intersecting with the intention of somebody else, and what does that produce? So kind of looking at that, how do we as fundraisers do our best to not only have good intentions, but to be careful that we're having the impact we want, realizing that we can't always fully control it because of people's personalities and backgrounds. But
Right.
what are some questions we can ask ourselves to try and think through what the impact might be so we aren't having those shaming experiences, kind of like what you were talking about there, Heather?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, Andy. But I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is just filtering whatever you're planning through. Where does this put the emphasis? Does this put the emphasis on the money, or does this put the emphasis on the Lord? Or, I mean, I guess even within that, does this put the emphasis on me, or does this put the emphasis on the Lord? So that's an initial question that comes to mind. What do you think? Or maybe not even the Lord, but the mission. Does this put the emphasis on the money or on the mission? Because really, going back to that story that was told with the relief organization, I think that, I mean, obviously, they should stand up there and call the church to do the work of the church. And I think they can do that boldly. I think they can ask for people to boldly engage that and expect that God is going to show up. But the follow-up was, the emphasis was on the money and not the mission. So I think that's a good clarification.
Yeah, and I think if you're a first-time fundraiser and you're worried about like offending people or wanting to get your phrasing right, I think what you brought up earlier about dignity, like always running it through that filter of dignity, not just will this image of this individual in this country who is hurting, will this be effective in pulling at somebody's heartstrings? The answer probably is yes, but is that the most ethical, dignified way to raise your funds? And I think not relying on strategies and formulas. We talk about that a lot too. I think people often have this idea like, hey, I'm going to offend somebody. Also, the other side of that, I'm going to offend somebody. And that's a huge obstacle for so many people. But I think the reality is, more often than not, is almost everybody is going to be just thrilled that you're stepping forward in obedience and you're doing something that the Lord is asking you to do. And especially if you're like majority American, like they know the drill. They've done this before. They give at the office, they give at church. And so you're walking into some very kind of well-established cultural current, right? So I think people, they know what to expect. They know this arena, and they're probably going to be happy and do it with dignity and just put the vision out there and the need and make the ask and then allow the Holy Spirit to do what he does.
That's so good. So I'd love to transition into a question about specifics here for a second, because I know people love to get down to the nitty gritty. And we've talked about forming versus deforming. So to bring that into a specific place, do you guys think there are some tools that are better at forming us well than others? Or are there some that have a natural forming or deforming effect that we need to be more cautious with? I mean, I guess tools. You think like if I pick up a knife versus I pick up a hammer versus I pick up a pencil. I mean, all of those are different types of tools.
Yeah.
A tool itself is neutral, but yeah, some lend themselves, a pencil and a sword lend themselves to slightly different tasks.
I think that it probably does primarily start with how you're holding it. right? Because a tool is a tool, but if you don't use it rightly, if you don't hold it rightly, then you can very early get into some big problems. This is a totally different type of example, but um, people in my family have gotten into weightlifting, and there's just a really big difference if you know how to lift that weight and if you just kind of like do whatever to get it up. Like it can like hurt your back, you know? And I think that the first thing I would say is that with any tool, it's really going to depend on the way you wield it and the way that you hold it. That is going to be the primary way I think that it can be forming or deforming. Beyond that, I think, gosh, I think it's such a gift that we have so much freedom, right? Like the word says that, and I think it is Paul, says that all things are beneficial, but they might not be, I'm sorry. Paul says that all things are permissible, but they might not be beneficial. And I really think that when it comes to tools, people should weigh that. You know, for one person, a stock template on a thank you note to a supporter might be okay for them to use. For another person, that actually might be deforming because it actually might be impeding them from pushing into the discomfort of channeling their gratitude in a very specific way, right? It might be enabling them to bypass really thinking about what their supporters have done and how that really impacts their life. So, yeah, I think those would be a couple of my thoughts.
Well, I like what you said, Stephanie, that the tool is neutral. So like money is neutral. I think the different methods that you approach are neutral. But I think if you hold on to one methodology too fervently, and you're like, this is going to do it for me. This is the skeleton key to my success. This chainsaw works. It always works. Well, maybe you need
Or
some
Windex.
Windex. Yeah. Just put some Windex on it. That'll fix it. Actually, maybe you need to be a little more adaptable, and you need to try something else, and you need to consider maybe the Lord is asking you to approach it differently and to release some of your expectations. One of the analogies we often use is fundraising it's not a formula. It's more like a recipe.
It's
And
good.
you're not necessarily even cooking the same thing. You're all just making a dessert. Right. And so whether you're sifting the flour or you're refrigerating the dough before you put it in the oven, you're going to get a product in the end. And there's often different paths to get something delicious, but they're all good. And so to say that, no, you have to do exactly this way. Well, you're not taking into account, what if I'm cooking at elevation and it's different here? I got to do things differently. I have to adjust.
Yeah. I think the other thing that comes to mind as Andy was talking is just, I think it's probably deforming if you become dependent on the tool.
Yeah.
Which there's a tension there because it's not like wrong to depend on a tool. I depend on my dishwasher every day, right?
His name's Joel.
Yeah.
by the
His
way.
name's Joel.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, and just back to what Angie just said about the formula, I think a lot of times people can really try to make this into a formula, and we would encourage them to think of it more as a framework or a scaffolding because there's some movement. There's it doesn't all have to be just so. With a formula, I think all parts have to be right on for that formula to work out. You're dependent on each of those things going right. Whereas with a framework or with scaffolding, you're free to take the best of it and pivot as you need to.
I love that you guys are metaphor people because I'm a metaphor people too. So I'm loving scaffolding and framework and really loving recipe too, because food, I mean, who doesn't love food? And I'm thinking of, the missionary as a chef. And I love that, or a cook. You don't have to be a professional. You can be a home cook, as they say on TV sometimes. And as a home cook who's cooking for others, I've got my style. I've got my way of doing things that is different from everybody around me. But also, as I'm cooking and I'm inviting different people to my table, I'm also recognizing that person might have a gluten allergy and that person might not like mushrooms. And that person might be really into sauces. And so I might adapt my recipe a little bit depending on who I'm cooking for. So I've got my base recipe, but that person doesn't want cheese, And so even with our supporters, we've got who we are. We're developing our own voice, our own way of doing things. And then we're shifting it a little bit depending on, is this person older and they're not really like a big technology person. So
Right.
they would prefer a phone call. So, and I love thinking about tools in this neutral space. And also thinking about, we talk about social media, I think, so much nowadays. So I don't want to certainly beat a dead horse, but I do think of tools like that I think sometimes they are not inherently bad, but they do have the potential to suck our time away or get us to compare or do things
Mhm.
like that. And so it's not to not use social media as a tool. I think it can be a phenomenal tool,
Right.
a fantastic tool. It has served me so well over the years in that fundraising space. But if I were to give, social media as an example of a tool that could potentially suck us into a place we don't want to go, are there any other ones that you would say, okay, use this tool just with caution, like a very sharp knife, pick it up, but as you said, Heather, learn how to wield it well and wield it very carefully because it's maybe a little sharper than some other ones.
This might not be popular, and I don't know, maybe I'll adjust it as time goes
Say it.
on. But I really think that we have such cool capabilities with AI coming onto the scene in such big, loud ways, right? I mean, I have so many emails in my inbox saying AI can build a course for you, AI can, write this for you. And AI is so cool. And I think it's a tool we are free to engage. And I really think we should be slow to give away our voice or the way we would want to communicate and the intention that we put into that communication. And so I think I would just encourage people, as this becomes something that's offered to you more and more in the different streams of your life, just really stop and think, like, is this allowing me to love my supporters more? Or is this
Shortcut.
yeah. Yeah. And sometimes shortcuts are okay. We never want to be like, over realized in this, but actually is that shortcut going to cost you something in your own character or your own felt connection to those people?
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So I think, would you want to start taking shortcuts in your ministry, like in the people you're meeting with, sharing the gospel with?
Right.
Probably not.
Should you ask ChatGPT to write you a sermon?
Probably not.
not.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think, like you said, it's a sharp knife, and I think it can be used, but you just really want to make sure you don't cut the wrong thing.
It's interesting that you say that. I got an email recently here at the office, and I don't remember exactly what it said, but I remember reading it, and they had pulled different things in from my life, and they had, I know that at this workplace, this is important, and they emphasized different strengths or different experiences at those different places that I had worked, and then they asked me to buy insurance. And I was like, wow, somebody must have really done their research on this. That's incredible. It's very personal. And my colleague was like, that's AI. That's 100% AI. I'm like, oh, delete. A, I don't want to buy insurance. B, that feels so dirty and conniving. Like you're trying to convince me that you know something about me. And it just it was a terrible taste.
Yeah.
That's a great example of a sharp knife.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think in communication, like I work with my clients about this, like, let's think of a communication strategy. And the two axes maybe are, what is the least obstacle for me? And what is the least obstacle for my recipients and for my donors? What's the neutral territory? So if you love TikTok, oh, bad news. I'm sorry to say. Or if you love Signal, that's a great one, right? But none of your donors are on Signal. It's probably too much to ask them to go and download that, right?
Yeah.
So you're asking constantly, like, what is the easiest thing for me to communicate regularly, frequently, and what's the easiest way for them to consume that information? So it can be different for everybody, but for most people, I'm like, as hard as it is, a lot of your donors are like my age and on Facebook. I know that's not hip anymore, but I feel like there's still some strategy there. Actually, I had a teammate who hated Facebook, a little older than me, just loathed it. But as part of his efforts to maintain connected connectedness to his donor base, every week he would put in his calendar, get on Facebook. And he would just post a picture or make a few comments, and then he'd peace out. And it was like discipline for him. So I think we have to think about it a little removed as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I have one more
definitely.
thought just to your prior question, Stephanie, and specifically with AI to kind of bring my point home. Andy and I are podcast hosts as well. I think that we do use AI sometimes to make the blurbs that go out on social media. And I feel okay with that. I wouldn't feel okay if Andy and I started using AI to basically like give us a script for the episode that we were going to record, right? Because it would just be a different level of giving up our voice, and it would be allowing the tool to step in something that actually doesn't need our heart behind it versus something that does. And so, yeah, that's a kind of a practical application
Full
of that.
disclosure.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I think most people are. We've used it to help put together talking points to share with people as well. Or I'll use ChatGPT as a little brainstorming buddy. I'm like, hey, what do you think about this? Or what's a different way of saying that? And as somebody who I'm an introvert, but also like to brainstorm with people, he can be like my little friend. And so I might not use exactly what he's saying, but whatever his name is, I should give. I feel like I should give him or her a name.
Yeah.
They can help you kind of think things through. So it's all these ethical questions that I think are so good to ask rather than saying full yes or full no. Like, okay, well, how can I use this tool, Lord, in a way that's God honoring, in a way that's forming me well? And I think if you use a tool and afterwards you feel a little like afterwards, pay attention to that feeling. Maybe it's good to be like, okay, do I like how I used that? Do I feel because it was uncomfortable and I've never used it before? Do I feel because I hate Facebook? Or do I feel like that, like a check in my spirit, like maybe I should ask somebody else who I trust, like what they think. And in any tool, Lord, how can I use this in a way that's God honoring and that's forming me well and helping me to connect with people in a life-giving way rather than a manipulative way or a scummy way, like you were saying there, Andy.
And to what you just said, I think that, another tool that's maybe more commonly used in the fundraising space currently is just like your name storm list, right? I think that the name storm list is a tool that can be so helpful in just widening perspective on who do I know? Like, who have I already had opportunity to meet? Who already has context for who I am in this world? Super helpful. When finding names for that name storm list starts to become like bigger in your mind than the presence of God, then I think it's not as helpful, right? Because I think that, I think that's maybe what is the word I'm looking for? Indication? Yeah. That's an indication that a tool is starting, you're starting to become more dependent on the tool than kind of like on the Lord's overall presence and equipping to use the tool.
Yeah.
To kind of wrap this up then for a missionary who's listening, who's feeling kind of like, okay, I don't know if I've really been engaging fundraising in a God-honoring way, and I'd like to make some shifts. What is a good next step for them? Where can they start?
Well, I would say you're normal, right? I think we're all going to hit spaces and have days where we're like, man, I just don't know about this. So be encouraged because you're not alone in that. I would say the first place that I would point people is towards some kind of community, whether that's a coach or what we call a core team, just people that you can be vulnerable with, that know you, that can pray with you, that can encourage you. That can reflect back to you what they're seeing that maybe you don't see. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, like riffing off of the core team idea, we talk about this all the time, but in what other job do you not get feedback about your performance? Like you always get feedback. Like you're working at a professional job, we have like an annual review, right? Missions, I feel like you don't often get that. Maybe you get it from your team. Maybe you get it from someone who's in authority, a team leader, a city director, or whatever, to a certain extent, but you never really get it from your network back home. So to have a core team of advisors And you're like, well, hey, can you hold me accountable? Can you pray for me? Can you encourage me? Can you also tell me how you felt about my communication this year? And how did I come across? Could you tell I was using ChatGPT? Probably I could, right? So having somebody to inviting them into that level of authority and just partnership in your ministry, I think is pretty powerful.
Mhm.
It's a great question just to ask people how you're coming across. I love that. Well, okay. And so Heather, you kind of hinted at coaching there a little bit. Talk for a second about what you guys offer at Provisio and how people can contact you, because coaching is a great next step.
Yeah, absolutely. So Provisio has a few different lanes of offerings. I mean, we've got the podcast. It's not about the money that Andy and I co-host and that we show up to without being fed by ChatGPT.
You're right.
Yeah, so we have the podcast. We do also have an online flexible asynchronous training program that really the value behind that was that it would be accessible, flexible, and affordable for people. So you can find that on our website. And then we have an option, and we have an option with that to have one-on-one coaching as you move through that curriculum to hopefully take those concepts and make them convictions.
I love that people who get coaching with you guys will get coaching not just on the what, but on the heart behind it all, as you've talked about today. So that would
Yes.
just make me feel very safe as a missionary to know that that's the perspective that it's coming from. So thank you guys so much for taking the time
Yeah.
to come on and share that with us today. I just really appreciate it. So on behalf of me and on all of our listeners, thank you, Heather and Andy. We really appreciate you.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you, Stephanie.